Ladies and gentlemen, it was my great privilege to edit the Australian edition of The Spectator magazine from 2008 to 2014. And I'll never forget the 2013 federal election. Obviously, it was a significant election in the sense that Kevin Rudd and Julia Gillard lost power and Tony Abbott came to power. But it was also significant because we witnessed the election to the Senate of a very unconventional political figure. And at the time, I published a cover story in The Spectator, "Free at last, mate." And here we have beautiful artwork of David Leyonhjelm, our guest speaker today, a gun-toting, marijuana smoking, fossil fuel burning, libertarian rebel. And the author of that article, Dean Bertram, said, quote, "Anyone of good sense or with a political sensibility placing them to the right of Lenin couldn't help but celebrate on Saturday, September 7. Electoral defeat of a disintegrating and duplicitous Labor government was a glorious event. But for Australians whose souls burn with the flame of liberty, that day delivered an additional and more important victory, the election of David Leyonhjelm to the Senate." And the author goes on to say, "Being a true liberal means that you are often embattled by both the right and the left establishments. It also means yours is a voice of reason in a world where bipartisanship has become code for a two-party duopoly introducing overreaching policies that only benefit power-broking special interests and a control-hungry bureaucratic machine." And he quotes David Leyonhjelm saying, "There are two guiding principles that determine our approach to legislation. We would never vote for an increase in taxes, and we would never vote for a reduction in liberty." And the author concludes, "You can hear the spirit of freedom channeled from centuries of liberal thought." Well, CIS takes no political positions. We're neither Liberal nor Labor. We, of course, host many politicians from a variety of schools of thought, although I don't think we've ever had anyone from the Greens. Never have, never will, probably. But we're very proud to introduce our guest speaker today, Senator David Leyonhjelm.
Thank you very much, Tom, and good afternoon, everybody. Quite a lot of familiar faces in the audience. Lovely to see you, and for those of you who aren't familiar with me, I hope I don't scare you off. You probably have heard a little bit about minor parties in the Senate in the last week or two. If you haven't been watching the Barnaby saga, perhaps you've heard a little bit about minor parties. And I had intended to talk about them even before all that chatter in the last couple of weeks, but now everyone's talking about them. So I thought I would spend some time today just sort of discussing how I think they've been playing out. You don't get to hear much about what goes on behind the scenes in the Senate with the minor parties, and I thought it might be useful to go over the background to them all, and then perhaps talk a little bit about what the future might hold for them. There have actually always been minor parties in the Senate, despite what you might think about recent history. And in most cases, they've had influence well beyond their numbers. Their history's not all good either. In fact, much of it's not good. Think about the Democrats, the fairies at the bottom of the garden people. They are responsible for our GST mess. Then there was Brian Harradine, who extracted enormous amounts of government spending for Tasmania when he had the balance of power. Nick Xenophon scared the Liberals in South Australia so much that they agreed to spend 3 times as much as necessary to build submarines in that state using subsidised steel produced in South Australia. But until 2007, the minor parties didn't work together very much. Many are based on a single issue. They tend to be rather fractious, and some are downright crazy. But in 2007, they began to realise that if they preferenced each other before the major parties, there was a better chance one of them would get elected. Not much happened in that election, but things went up a notch in 2010. My party, the Liberal Democrats, nearly won a seat in New South Wales because of minor party preferences. In 2013, this cooperation went up to the next level. Several parties formed a group and swapped preferences with each other before any others. That led to the election of Ricky Muir in Victoria from the Motoring Enthusiast Party and Bob Day from Family First in South Australia. Now, those two were actually the only senators ever elected as a result of this cooperation, but it had a big impact. The government convinced itself the system was being rorted or gamed, as they put it, and teamed up with the Greens to change it. Now, they could have used its system to their own advantage if they'd wanted. They could have just asked me how to do it if they liked, but they didn't. They were never that smart. Now, the Senate voting system was changed with the help of the Greens. I blame Simon Cowan for that. He cheered them on. I've never forgiven him for it. And the Senate voting system now is essentially optional preferential. It is much more difficult for a minor party to win a seat unless they are an existing player or they have a lot of money, like Clive Palmer. It's hard to see how that's an improvement on the old system. And yet, change system or not, minor parties will win some seats and they will continue to hold the balance of power. But working together was not the only factor to influence the composition of the Senate. We've also seen a sharp increase in the vote for minor parties. In the 2007 and 2010 elections, the share of the formal vote for the minor parties, that is not the Liberals and Nationals or Labor or the Greens, was about 9%. However, it jumped to 21% in 2013 and 22% in 2016. Clearly, something is going on. I describe it as the none of the above vote. For various reasons, the major parties are being rejected. Sometimes it's over a specific issue. Sometimes they just want change, a disruptor who will stir things up, or they're looking for a messiah to lead them to the promised land. It has a lot in common with Trump's drain the swamp appeal. In 2013, it was largely Clive Palmer who benefited. He won 3 Senate seats plus his own lower house seat of Fairfax. Nick Xenophon was also a beneficiary. He won a Senate seat in South Australia and only missed out on a second one because he was too silly to negotiate preferences. In 2016, in the double dissolution, Pauline Hanson was the main beneficiary, winning 4 Senate seats, plus Nick, who won 3 seats in South Australia. The Liberal Democrats, I got re-elected, of course, but we came close to winning a second seat in Queensland and got very narrowly beaten on preferences. My election in 2013 didn't rely on preferences. I got 9.5% of the primary vote, enough to get elected at number 5. But in 2016, my vote fell to 3.1%, which was just enough to squeak in at number 12 in the double dissolution. So I only got 2 years out of a 6-year term. I didn't have Pauline's 20-odd years of notoriety, and I didn't have Clive's millions. I also wasn't first on the ballot paper for the second time, which was a factor, I have to admit. But despite squeaking back in, I am clearly a survivor. I am the only crossbench senator still there from the previous parliament. Glenn Lazarus from Queensland, John Madigan from Victoria, Ricky Muir from Victoria, and D.O. Wang from WA were not re-elected in 2016. That's 4 out of the 8. The other 4 were re-elected, but Jackie Lambie resigned because of dual citizenship, Bob Day resigned because his business failed, and Nick Xenophon resigned so he could run in South Australia. That leaves just me as one of the original 8 from the 2013 election on the crossbench. Now, in this current parliament, since this 2016 election, Jackie Lambie's replacement, Steve Martin, has joined the Nationals. Bob Day's replacement, Lucy Gashui, has joined the Liberals. Malcolm Roberts was One Nation in Queensland, was ruled ineligible because of dual citizenship and was replaced by Fraser Anning, and he announced yesterday he's just joined Katter Australia Party. When Pauline tried to get him to stand aside so Malcolm would return, he bailed out of One Nation. Rod Cullerton in WA was ruled ineligible due to a conviction and replaced by Peter Giorgio. And Fraser Anning is predicting at the moment that Peter won't last long with the One Nation either. Sky Kokoschki-Moore from Nick Xenophon Party resigned due to dual citizenship and was replaced by Tim Storer, who left Nick Xenophon's team and sits as an independent. Wouldn't be surprised if he joins the Greens. He's a bit of a lefty. Nick Xenophon himself resigned, of course, and was replaced by Rex Patrick. And, of course, Corey Bernardi resigned from the Liberal Party to join the crossbench. Now, and as I'm sure you know, Brian Burston has fallen out with Pauline. If Peter Giorgio isn't endorsed as One Nation's candidate in WA in the next few weeks, I'd say he'll part company with her as well. That's what Fraser Anning was predicting yesterday. But just to remind you that it wasn't all about the crossbench. The Greens, Scott Ludlam and Larissa Waters, were replaced due to dual citizenship, as were the Nationals' Fiona Nash and the Liberals' Stephen Parry, except Fiona was replaced by a Liberal. On the Labor side, Sam Dastyari went because of an excessive fondness for things Chinese, and Katie Gallagher due to dual citizenship. In some respects, the only normal departure was George Brandis, who is now Australia's High Commissioner in London. He was replaced by Amanda Stoker. And yet, for all that change, the government's position in the Senate hasn't really changed. With Steve Martin joining the coalition, the crossbench is now back to 10 members, of which the government needs 8 to reach 39. For all the change that's occurred, on a contested issue, the government can still only afford to lose 2 votes. It's been the same ever since the 1st of July 2014. It can lose 2 crossbench votes, it can't lose 3. It hasn't changed, notwithstanding all of that turnover on the amongst the Senate, particularly amongst the crossbench. And yet, being able to lose 2 votes but not 3 on the crossbench is still better than what it was in the period between the government, the coalition winning the election in September 2013 and mid-2014 when Labor and the Greens, during which period Labor and the Greens had a majority. Absolutely nothing got through during that period. With the support of the crossbench, the Liberal National Government has got stuff through. It repealed the carbon tax and the mining tax, for example. It re-established the ABCC and created the Registered Organisations Commission. More recently, it reformed Childcare, throwing several million more dollars at it. It reformed school funding, misrepresenting it as Gonski 2.0 and throwing several billion dollars more at it. It commissioned a new submarine to be built in South Australia using Australian steel. That's $50 billion, for which no legislation was needed. It imposed a deficit reduction levy, a bank levy, the GST on low-value imports, fees on foreign investors, the diverted profits tax, higher tobacco excise, and changes to superannuation. It was going to impose an increase in the Medicare levy too to fund the NDIS, but it dropped that. It introduced the Bear Bill, which allows the public servants in APRA to tell the banks how to run their business, including their remuneration policy. In each of these, it had the numbers. To be fair, it did try to do better at first. The 2014 budget would have changed the trajectory of debt and deficit for the better, but they failed to push it. Joe Hockey couldn't sell a glass of water to a thirsty man. I think I was the only crossbench senator to support every savings measure that came before the Senate. Not even Bob Day did that. The government has also lowered company tax for companies up to $50 million. I voted for that with some reservations. It is bad policy to have differential tax rates based on company size. It's as if we don't want our companies to be successful and grow. But still, some sort of tax cut was better than no tax cut. So where does this all leave us? Notwithstanding the considerable skills of Matthias Cormann, I doubt the company tax cuts will get through. Tim Storer, as I said before, is a serious lefty. Darren Hinch is a closet green, which is another word for a serious lefty. Pauline doesn't know what she believes in and is worried about Longman, and after that she'll worry about something else. The Centre Alliance Party guys, used to be Nick Xenophon guys, are only slowly moving away from the lefty positions left to them by Nick Xenophon. They are improving, it must be said. And of course Labor and the Greens have decided that anything less than 100% tax amounts to wasting money on rich people. So the omens are not all that good. I expect the government will switch to personal tax cuts in August and have a fight with Labor over whether to split the bill to implement the income tax cuts alone, or the low income tax cuts alone. We look like having an election with one of the key issues being whether a tax rate of 47% is high enough. Amongst all that, I sometimes feel like the only straight guy at a Mardi Gras party. We in the Liberal Democrats are a highly principled libertarian party. We firmly believe in small government at every level, low taxes, a balanced budget, less regulation, leaving people alone both economically and socially. A number of people in Parliament agree with me, mostly in the Liberal Party, although occasionally people in other parties quietly tell me that they are a bit libertarian themselves, including Labor and the Greens. But it doesn't seem to help. Senator Scott Ryan used to say that when he saw me and Bob Day voting on the other side of the chamber, he knew that he was voting on the wrong side. Senator Zed Cecilio recently called out crystal clear consistency to me when I was on the opposite side in a division. I'm not sure if he meant it as a compliment, but I took it that way anyhow. But no matter how much they agree with me, it doesn't change the way they vote. I find it bizarre that principled consistency should be so unusual, and yet it seems I'm practically unique. When I first voted with the Greens on a matter of principle, I was ridiculed, mostly by government side. Now when I do it, a number of Liberals feel guilty. I voted with Labor on a matter of principle from time to time too, although I'm not sure principle is a concept they understand very well. And yet nothing changes. The day after I was elected, I said in multiple interviews, as Tom has mentioned, that I would never vote for an increase in taxes or a reduction in liberty. So I invariably oppose bills that increase taxes, that increase spending, that reverse the onus of proof, that remove the right to silence, that compromise freedom of speech and religion, that don't treat Australians equally under the law, or that impose restrictions designed to save us from ourselves. Despite being unusual, having consistent principles seems to be attractive to my crossbenchers nonetheless. In the previous Parliament, I ended up attracting quite a following. Bob Day and I were on the same side pretty much from the beginning, at least on economic stuff. But D.O. Wang spent more and more time in my office, soaking up our philosophy, and becoming more and more pro-business. Ricky Muir was drawn to my position too, initially over civil liberties, particularly in relation to the national security bills that were coming through, but broadening over time. Now, and that's, you can tell the difference that occurred because since he left Parliament, he bought the business in which he used to be a blue-collar employee and union representative. John Madigan was an old-fashioned blue-collar Labor man, ex-DLP, resigned from the DLP. I worked with him on a couple of select committees and developed good rapport. In the months leading up to the 2016 election, he was seeking my advice and assistance more and more. There's even hope for old-fashioned blue-collar Labor people. Even Jackie Lambie supported me from time to time, telling people that I was very smart. I'm not sure what she meant by smart, but I didn't argue. It sometimes allowed me to get her vote. To a lesser extent, that's happening in the current Parliament. Corey, Fraser, Anning and I are now the biggest bloc. I expect Brian Burston will join us too. And if we had sufficient time before the next election, who knows what we might achieve. Principal consistency is also appealing to the media. Not surprisingly, they tend to be very cynical about politicians and given so many weasel words and shifting policies. The media quite like coming to me because I am not like that. Occasionally, I even get a journalist telling me that I'm not a very good libertarian because of something or other. That's good, because it allows me to explain to the journalist that they don't actually understand the concept very well. Not many of them are libertarians, but at least they think they know, and that's a start. They never used to think about it at all before I was elected. That's progress. So, what of the future? I still believe many voters are looking for an alternative to the major parties. Every controversy over broken promises, travel expenses or indecision reinforces that. Given the current crop of leaders, it's hard to see that changing. Who will they vote for? I can't see Clive making a successful comeback, although he's obviously thinking about it. I think Pauline's support is declining, although she will continue to have core support, and she does have a 6-year term, so she'll be in the Senate for a while yet. Nick Xenophon's star crashed to earth in the South Australian election. He's apparently sworn off politics, although I wonder for how long that will last. You couldn't rule out a return, although his appeal is pretty much limited to South Australia. If he doesn't return, neither of his two party members now in the Senate, nice fellows, but neither of them have Nick's charisma. Corey Bernardi's new party, Incorporating Family First, didn't catch on in the South Australian election, and he lost his seat in that parliament, his state seat. But he also has a 6-year term, so he might be able to turn that around. But because of the new Senate voting system, many small parties are giving up. They will be required to re-register before the election anyway, which will also sort a fair few out. So there should be fewer on the ballot paper. Now I'd like to, perhaps I'm kidding myself, but I'd like to think the Liberal Democrats' day is coming. That a party with principles and values, it's not a personality cult, that sticks to what it believes in is worth supporting. Despite not being outrageous, not doing stunts, not including my name in the party name, and not flip-flopping on issues, I'd like to think those things are appealing. We can be the quiet achievers of minor parties. We'd like to think so anyway. There are grounds for optimism. There is enormous concern in the community about the budget deficit. We, Liberal Democrats, are strong on ways to cut spending to fix that. We know there are many groups in the community that just want to be left alone. Smokers, gamblers, drinkers, motorbike riders, fishers, shooters, four-wheel drivers, modified car enthusiasts, computer gamers, airsoft enthusiasts, on it goes. We get that, and we are reaching out to them. And of course there are businesses suffering from red tape, intrusive regulations, anti-discrimination laws, employment laws and all the rest, who just want to be left alone to make a buck. Our support will inevitably be limited by the fact that we're not a party that promises to increase unemployment benefits or the age pension. We won't subsidise the steel industry or agriculture or renewables. We don't support the government owning the NBN. We don't think the NDIS is a good idea. We would buy submarines already built from overseas, and we absolutely support the coal industry. For all that, we think there's enough people out there who agree with us for us to become a significant influence in Australian politics. Our challenge is to ensure they know who we are and what we stand for, so they can decide. Thank you for coming to hear me today, and I'm happy to take questions.
Okay, it's time for questions, and our first question will come from my colleague, Head of Research, Simon Cowan.
The guilty man.
Exactly. Look, thank you, Senator, for coming and speaking today, and you rightfully picked me up on Twitter the other day about generalising about all politicians. Unfortunately, I fear that with your speech today, you are the exception rather than the rule for the behaviour of politicians, and indeed that leads to my question. back in 2014, I think it was, you and I shared a platform at St Leonard's. We talked about what was then the minor party moment, the election of a number of new minor parties, the rise of, at the time Xenophon, it was Palmer's group. A couple of years on, I'd like your reflections on how you think that went and whether or not you would agree with a thesis that said at the time we thought minor parties that largely stood on principles were likely to see more and more airtime and to be elected. What we've seen instead is a number of one-person parties based on rank populism in a number of different states rise and fall with the popularity of their leader. And we've now come to a point where the new Senate voting rules are likely to come in this election, the next election, and remove a lot of those people out. Do you think that the minor parties made the best of their moment? Do you think we were naively optimistic in 2014 about the influence that policy might have on the minor party movement, and whether or not you feel that your time in the Senate has been, you've achieved what you wanted to achieve when you were elected in 2013?
There's quite a lot of questions there. My view on the minor parties is that they didn't win voters, the major parties lost them. So the minor parties would not have achieved their popularity in the Senate vote in particular had it not been for poor policy decisions, Tweedledum and Tweedledummer type behaviour by, in particular, Labor and Liberals, and the fact that the Greens are largely seen as a party of protest and are a party of protest. Labor is attempting to stop them from eating their lunch on the left wing, and Liberals are, to some extent, moving to the left because they're worried that there's going to be too much of a distinction between them and Labor. To a degree, we get the minor parties as well as the government we deserve. If you think there is a quick fix to things, if you think, like all the people who voted for Bernie Sanders, like the people who voted for Jeremy Corbyn, that other people's money, they're not entitled to if they've got more than you, then you will vote for politicians who reflect that. The Labor Party is gambling quite heavily on that notion right now with their tax policies. As I said in my address before, there were people moving away from the major parties, disenchanted. They moved to the minor parties, and so there was a mixture of reasons, and a substantial component of it was a look for a search for a quick fix, a messiah, a disruptor, something that's going to change the big parties being Tweedledum and Tweedledummer. What's their future? That does depend on whether the electorate says, okay, there's a big enough problem now to vote for a party with a solution. Tony Abbott, when he launched Pauline Hanson's book, said minor parties are good at identifying problems, they're not so good at coming up with solutions. That's a very apt summary of it, and particularly for One Nation and pretty much all the minor parties except for the Liberal Democrats, we have solutions, we think. So if people continue to vote for parties which they think that identify problems but don't need to highlight solutions, or go for simplistic solutions such as just cut immigration and that will solve things, just increase taxes on the rich, that will solve things, or do something, one thing, one favourite thing. Even on the libertarian side, we have our people who have reintroduced the gold standard that will fix everything, that kind of stuff. People who go for simplistic, easy fixes will continue to look about. The question, of course, is will they, having been dissatisfied with Clive, I think now having been dissatisfied with Pauline, being dissatisfied with Nick, will they go back to the major parties? I think that's probably the key question. I can't see it because the major parties are not doing anything to win them back. They're still as bad as they were when they left them. And so where will they go? I don't know. I don't know. I hope it's the Liberal Democrats, but it may be they'll stick with Pauline. It may be there'll be another Clive come along with another $10 or $20 million and say, hey, look at me, aren't I clever? I don't know where that vote will end up, but I can't see it going back to the major parties until they lift their game. And I can't see either of them lifting their game until there's sufficient reason to lift their game. They've got to lose more votes first.
Next question. Adam Conley.
Senator, you did a great job at explaining philosophically what you and your party stand for. You then took us through how you're negotiating with the other minor party members in order to bring about change. And then you spoke very briefly at the end about some of the policy positions you have. I wonder if you could tell us what is the number one thing from a legislative point of view that you want to achieve between now and the next election that would be the blueprint for your re-election?
I've got it's probably not appropriate to just look at number one. I don't think there is one issue that will guarantee my re-election or the election of any others from my party. I think it's a multitude of issues. And as I've said, there are a lot of people who just want to be left alone. They're not necessarily libertarians. They're not necessarily supporters of all of our policies, but they are political orphans, and they will respond when they see a political party that understands their issues and speaks up for them. Donald Trump did that. He found groups, or his campaign found groups who just wanted to be left alone, and he reached out to them, and we know what the result was. So I don't think there's one thing. There are a couple of headline issues that I am pursuing between now and the election, one of which is free speech. We all know about the 18C debate, but there are a multitude, something like 23 acts in which it is an offence to offend a public official, some sort of bureaucrat. Now, I don't know what offend means, and I don't know whether anybody can define it, and it doesn't need to be in legislation. So I have a private bill which I will be introducing probably in about 3 weeks, which will remove all of those references to offend from existing legislation. I've got two others on free speech as well. One relates to national security. They're mostly driven during the Tony Abbott period as Prime Minister, although the Turnbull administration has continued on a little bit with them. Quite a lot of restrictions on media in particular reporting on national security issues, where even when it's historical, even when the AFP or ASIO, whoever it was, were up to no good and misbehaving, even if there's no public interest in keeping something secret, there's still legislation that says you can go to jail for divulging this stuff. It's not something that should be countenanced in a democratic society. And there's a couple of, I've got a third bill which also relates to free speech, sort of miscellaneous group of matters, including the fact that you can't use the word Anzac. It's against the law to use the word Anzac. So, and I have a bill already to repeal 18C. So between all four of them, it's a fairly big onslaught to wind back free speech restrictions. I've got a couple of others that I'm working on, but I might just leave it at that one.
Okay, I think we've got time for one more question. Andrew Murray.
Senator, thanks very much for your speech. It was most interesting. We've got two major parties now that seem very reluctant to talk about cutting expenditure. You've got the Labor Party, who said they brought out 6 or 7 policy matters, and they're very proud of them, but all of them are tax increases. The Liberal Party, I understand, are probably working quietly behind the scenes to reduce the welfare payments, but no one wants to talk about it. What would you do, and where do you think the cuts could be made, and what sort of support do you think there is for cutting expenditure?
Yes, you're right. I don't disagree with anything you said. There's reluctance to attack it. The Labor Party is mainly interested in raising taxes. They won't tackle spending. The Liberal Party knows spending should be tackled, but they're very reluctant to do a serious job of it. I'm not sure if you've followed my alternative budgets in the financial review. I've done 5 of them, I think, in a row now. The most recent one, I spelt out exactly where I thought some spending could occur without having people starving in the streets, which is the sort of scenario that people trot out. And I think the place to start is middle class welfare. And I did very little pushback, even on the ABC, when I start talking about middle class welfare. A good place to start is the Childcare subsidy. From the 1st of July, 2 payments are now being folded into one. And there's some improvements in the way it's been restructured, but the cost to the taxpayers went up by several $billion. And had it not been for the fact that I blackmailed the government over a matter, it would be open-ended. You could be earning $1 million a year and still eligible to receive up to $10,000 a year childcare subsidy. It's absolutely unconscionable. And the government needed my vote on a procedural matter. As a matter of fact, I wait and wait and wait for issues like that, because then I've got them by the delicate bits, and that gives me leverage. So it was just beautiful. I needed another vote, so I rang up that genius Darren Hinch, and just for once he agreed with me. And so I knew I had the numbers, and we said to the government, you're not getting us on this procedural matter unless you put a cap on childcare subsidy. And as a result, you can only get that, you can't get anything once your income is over $350,000. Now, $350,000, I don't quite know how we ended up at $350,000. I tried to taper it from $200,000 to $350,000, but I didn't get support on that one. The Labor Party spoke against that amendment. I introduced it as an amendment. The Labor Party spoke against it. The Greens spoke against it, and then when it went to the vote, nobody voted against it. Went through on the voices. Whenever I talk about that, people shake their heads in astonishment. How could someone on $349,900 still qualify for a childcare subsidy? And yet I had some journalists say, oh no, it'll stop my wife coming back to work. Really, get over it. So that's an example. There are plenty of others. You can still get family tax benefit A up to an income of $217,000. Your parents can be the richest people in Australia. If you are disabled, you can still receive a disability support pension on top of an NDIS package. So there are some really low-hanging fruit. There's plenty more where that came from. And HEX loans, for example, are not means tested at all. So there's lots and lots of low-hanging fruit, which I think people would respond to. But of course, the Liberal Party's problem is many of the people who would lose those benefits are core Liberal supporters, and they're not in any hurry to go and antagonise them. They did antagonise them big time over superannuation, of course, and I think they got it wrong on that. I think they could afford to antagonise a few on handouts, and I think they'd get away with it, and it would create the atmosphere that says welfare, other people's money, is for poor people. It's not for prosperous people. It's for poor people. It is charity. The fact that the government is in between the taxpayer and the recipient doesn't change the fact that it is charity. Welfare is charity, and it's nothing to be proud of. You may need it, and we shouldn't begrudge giving it to people who need it, but there's no pretending it's an entitlement for anything other than the fact that you can't look after yourself with your own means.
David, thank you. Thank you. Ask him afterwards. The Centre for Independent Studies is very fortunate to have a very distinguished board of directors. Our chairman, Peter Mason, is here in the audience today, and I see Ross Grant. Thank you so much for coming. Another one of our board members is Sam Kennard, and I call on Sam to do the vote of thanks for David.
Thanks, Tom. Thank you, everybody. David mentioned, my name's Sam Kennard, Managing Director of Kennard Self-Storage, board member for the CIS, ally and co-conspirator with the Liberal Democrats and David Leyonhjelm. He mentioned principled consistency, and I wrote some notes just in case, but vote of thanks is to go to the remarks, but they are entirely consistent with everything he's said today. My connection to the LDP goes back to before he was elected, and someone alerted me to this party that was libertarian, and I didn't believe them, but once I did some research and discovered, it did dawn on me that it was real, and then to our delight, David was elected. Since then, my engagement with them has increased, and most recently, and it's no secret that I ran as David's number 2 in the New South Wales ticket for the Federal Senate. I think David would have liked some friends in Federal Parliament, where he mentioned how our Queensland guy nearly got in, but it would have enabled us to create and have some factions, and I think David would very much have liked to have run the moderate faction. So I haven't been disappointed at all with David's effort and contribution to the debate. It's over the years. I think he is the rare voice for small government, the rare voice for lower taxes and reducing spending and reducing debt and greater freedom. It's the future generations that will benefit from those ideas. It's this generation that needs to stop asking for a bigger government and more handouts and expect more from government. But it's the thoughtful, consistent, principled positions that make him entirely predictable to me. Any idea will come up, and I'll know if you follow him, you'll know where he'll stand on it and where he'll land on it. And so we just need a few more David Leyonhjelms, I think. Additionally, the work rate and output from the office and from David's team is exceptional. The op-eds and the opinion pieces and the thought pieces that come out, plus the work rate that he does on radio interviews and TV is exceptional. So I think the party certainly punches above its weight. So on behalf of the CIS, I'd like to thank David for those remarks and the insight into how we make the sausages in Canberra. So thank you.
Sam, thank you very much, and thank you too, David. We at the CIS have some upcoming events. I won't go into detail about our events, except that on July 10, we are hosting the former Prime Minister, John Howard. My colleague, Jeremy Salmon, and I will be having a conversation with Mr. Howard about key cultural issues that this country faces. And in the course of the next few weeks, we'll be launching a program called Culture, Prosperity and Civil Society. And among other things, it's about defending cultural freedom and religious freedom. This is very important for us at CIS. We have commissioned some polling from YouGov. We will release it in the course of the next week or two. And we've asked YouGov to poll about 1,000 millennials, Australians. So these are young Australians who were born between 1980 and 1996. So their age group is about 22 to 36 or so. And the results, frankly, are disturbing. I don't want to give too much away, but I'll give you a teaser. 62%, these are millennials, believe that, quote, ordinary workers in Australia are worse off today than they were 40 years ago. It gets worse. 58% have a favourable view of socialism, and just 18% have an unfavourable view. You ponder that. This is the future of the country. And I won't give too much away, except I will say this, I found this extraordinary, but it does reflect international trends. Only, can you believe this, only 21% of millennials are familiar with Chairman Mao Zedong. So I could go on and on. We're going to release these polls in coming weeks, and we're going to drive a campaign to promote cultural freedom, but also keep our school educators to account. I mean, what is happening in these high schools and indeed universities? And many of you are no doubt familiar with the dramas with the Ramsay Centre in trying to find a good university location to host a centre that defends Western civilisation. ANU just last week pulled out because of left-wing pressure. So this is what we're up against, and CIS will be fighting the good fight along with David Leyonhjelm and other like-minded organisations to defend our Western heritage, cultural freedom and our religious freedom. So I hope you can join us on July 10 to get the ball rolling, and stay tuned in the meantime for some very disturbing polls. But Jeremy and I will be everywhere in the course of the next few weeks making the case that this is a serious problem we face in the younger generation. We hope to see you next time. Thank you so much for being here, and thanks again, Senator Leyonhjelm.